Hey everyone, this is David Pike, the Motorcity Mechanic, and I'm back with another video. Now today I'm going to be showing you how to replace the oil pressure sending unit on a 3.6 liter Pentastar engine that you're going to find in a Dodge Charger, Dodge Challenger, and also Chrysler 300. Check it out. Now when it comes time to replacing that oil pressure sending unit on that 3.6 liter and the rear wheel drive vehicles, you're going to find out there really is no shortcut. You're going to have to take the upper intake off and you're going to have to take the lower intake off. So there's going to be some steps involved, some seals that need to replace, stuff like that. Now keep in mind, if you're getting close to that interval where it's time to replace the spark plugs, make sure to do it at that time because you're already going to have the upper intake off as well. So let's go ahead and get started so you see everything you need to do. Usually there's a plastic cover that covers up the top half of the engine right here. It's got a little cutout right here for the oil filter. You can actually see a line right here where it used to be. This one doesn't have it on it. Whoever worked on it last more than likely didn't put it back on, but usually you would see a plastic cover sitting right on top of the engine that you would just pick up and sit it to the side. Now it does not matter if you're doing the plugs, the oil filter housing, or the oil pressure sending unit. Whatever you do, you're going to have to take off all the following items. The air inlet that goes over here to the throttle body is going to need to come off, and also the upper intake. With the upper intake off, you've got access to the spark plugs, but in order to get to the cooler assembly, you're going to have to take the lower intake assembly off. So what we'll do is we'll start with getting the air inlet off first. Now one thing that I prefer to do is to leave the upper air filter lid attached to the air inlet going to the throttle body. You could separate it right here where the flexible joint is, but what I do is I go around the perimeter, I take the three 8mm off, and I take the hose off right here that leads back to one of the valve covers, and I leave this attached to the air inlet. That way I can pick it up and I've got a little more room. Now the hose, get whatever you can to pry it off. You may have to rotate it slightly. You may just take a gentle motion like this. There we go, we've got that off. Now we can pick up on the front of the housing, and now we've got it released. Now we'll move on further down. Now if you follow the air inlet around to the throttle body, you'll see that there's one hose clamp right here, a larger one. You can get you a flat tip screwdriver or an 8mm, back it off. And what we're going to do now is we're going to pick up on the front half, because there's a rubber bushing that sits on a mount right here. We don't want to break it off, so we just kind of wiggle it till we finally get it loose, and we can work on getting it off the throttle body. Now we got one connector back here we've got to disconnect. That's for the air intake temp sensor. Just squeeze in on the lock and pick it up. Now here's that rubber bushing I was telling you about, and it goes directly on a ball mount right here on the right side valve cover. When you go back with it, apply a little bit of grease so when it lines up, it easily seats back in place. Now we can pick it up and set this off to the side. Now the upper intake has a series of brackets around the outside, or braces. Kind of keeps it rigid, stops it from flexing, stops it from cracking. We've got two brackets over here on the left side of the engine that are attached with two 10mm nuts that will be taken off. And also back here behind where the throttle body is, on the back side of this intake, we've got another bracket. Now that's got a studded bolt and also two nuts that will be taken off. So we'll go ahead and start with the two 10mm over here, and then we'll move over to those shortly afterwards. Now what I've found that works great for taking those two 10mm nuts off that are both here and there is a 10mm ratchet wrench. And get right down on there, break it loose, and get them loose enough to where I can get them off the rest of the way by hand. And that's the first one right there. Now I can move over to the second one. Then I'll know that the brackets on this side are unbolted from the intake. And what's going to help so that you can get to the two nuts and that studded bolt that holds the bracket on the back of the intake is to go ahead and start taking everything electrical and all the vacuum and rubber lines off the throttle body and the upper intake. Once you get those out of the way, you've got a little more room to see everything and to get to everything. So that's what we'll move on to next. We'll go ahead and get some of these electrical connectors disconnected and pull the rubber hoses off. Now in order to release the connector for the electronic throttle body, we've got to release this connector right here, and it's got a 2-stage lock on it. The gray portion right here is going to slide back. Once we slide it back, like I said, if you need to use something like this flat tip screwdriver to help you, so be it. Once you release that, then you can actually squeeze down on it and slide the connector off. And we just take the catch right here that positions the harness right here, pull that off as well. Located directly behind the electronic throttle body is a sensor, and that sensor is the map sensor. It's got a gray colored connector on this particular vehicle with a red secondary lock. Now in order to release that, you're going to have to slide the red portion back. Use whatever tool you need. Usually sometimes you can get it with your fingers. Sometimes if it's been on for a while, you're going to have to use something like a flat tip screwdriver. Once that secondary lock is slid back, you can squeeze in on the gray connector and release it. Now with that map sensor disconnected, we need to pull up on the wiring. We don't need the wiring attached to the upper intake because we'll be pulling it off. So plastic / metal fastener right here that grabs on one of the ribs right here and kind of guides the wiring. That's what we just released and pulled off. Now we'll move on to the vacuum hose right here. I'm using nothing more than a pair of needle nose, kind of break it loose and work it up and off. Now the intake has 2 more rubber hoses we need to get off. We've got one right here that leads over to the brake booster, and we've got one right here that goes from the intake down to the PCV valve. So these 2 right here need to be taken off. We'll kind of do the same thing we did with this hose right here. Grab a pair of needle nose, see if we can break it loose by rotating it, and then pry it off. That's one off. Now we'll move over to the back one for that PCV valve. There you have it. The PCV valve hose is now off the intake. Now if you look right here, you see me pointing to 2 10mm nuts. That's 2 of them that we need to take off for the bracket. 13mm studded bolt will be further down in there, but we'll work on getting to those. Now if you need a little room, you can actually take this wiring harness off the bracket. It's fastened or routed there with one of those plastic Christmas tree type fasteners. I'll take it. That way you got a little more room to get to everything. Now we'll move down into showing you where that 13mm studded bolt is. Now this is where I just took off those 2 10mm nuts, and this is the bracket that we're working on. If you look right here, you'll see that there's a wiring harness. And that wiring harness has a plastic guide right here. And that guide slides over that 13mm studded bolt. And the reason why it's studded is so that that guide has somewhere to attach and keeps the wiring harness from rubbing up against things it doesn't need to come in contact with. So what I've got to do is I've got to slide that guide off that 13mm studded bolt, and then I can get access to it, start backing it all the way off, take the bolt off, and then the bracket can be pulled out of the way to where the studs that come through the intake right here, that those 10mm nuts for holding on, will no longer be going through the bracket, and then I can start working on unbolting the intake and taking it off. So like I said, we'll go ahead and start using whatever we need to, pry bar, long needle nose, whatever it takes to pry the wiring harness off that studded 13. Actually some long needle nose, and get down in there between the bolt and the plastic, start prying on it. It starts releasing. There you have it. And now I can get down to this stud right here. Like I said, it's a 13mm. Now the upper intake's bolted to the lower intake with a total of 7 8mm bolts. Now what I recommend using is a 1/4 inch 8mm, because you don't have a lot of room in some of these places, and your 3/8 8mm is usually going to be too wide. I've got it attached to a cordless impact. Going to go down and do each one until we have them all backed off. So now at this point we have nothing electrical, no rubber hoses, no bolts, no brackets holding it in place. We do have two studs over here with the two 10mm went through the brackets. So what we're going to do is we're going to pick up and come out the right side. And there you have it. If you look right here, you'll see the two studs that I was telling you about and the two brackets that they go through. And when we go back with them, we're going to do this. We're going to line up those studs through the brackets. We're going to lower it down in place. Make sure we slide them in there because we only took one bracket off when we left those two in place. Now that we've got that upper intake out of the way, what we need to do is remove this foam pad from the left side cylinder head. That way we got more access to the bolts for the lower intake and also to the electrical connectors as well for the injectors, and also for getting it out of the way by unplugging the coils as well. So now the upper intake's out of the way, what I recommend doing is grabbing some rags and shoving them down the ports of the lower intake. That way, while we're working on it, we don't drop anything down in there. Now eventually this will be coming up and off, but for now what we're going to do is we're going to cover the ports. Now what I want to start doing is I want to start disconnecting all the electrical harnesses up here, all the coil packs as well as the injectors, and then I'm going to disconnect the harnesses where they attach to the valve cover, and I'm going to pull them out of the way. Main reason why is I want to get to the bolts around the perimeter of the lower intake. So next what we'll do is we'll move on unplugging the coil packs. Now in order to get to the injector connectors down here between the intake and the valve covers, what I recommend doing is going ahead and actually unfastening the harnesses from the valve cover. All I'm going to be using is some metal door panel removal tools to try to get in here between the plastic fasteners and the valve cover. Now have no fear, if some of these break coming off, you're okay. Some of these have been on here a long time and they do not want to release. It's just the nature of the beast. Just take your time and try to do it the best you can. And once you start getting them off, move on to the next one, and then you'll have more room to get down in here to the connector releases for the injectors. Now the connector for the injector has a two-stage lock. That red piece right here needs to be pulled upward by using whatever tool you can. And then we can squeeze in on the main connector and pull it off. Like I said, that's the red piece that you need to pull up. Then you can squeeze in right here, right below it, and that releases the primary lock and just pull straight out. Go ahead and repeat that on the other 6. So now you can just go around and release the rest of the connectors for the injectors. Once you get them all fully released, we'll go ahead and pull the harness out of the way. Now right before we go ahead and start unbolting the intake, if you've got access to compressed air, what I'd like for you to do is actually blow around the perimeter. That way if any kind of leaves, dust, dirt, anything that's accumulated right there, once we pick up the intake, it doesn't have a tendency to fall down into the ports on the cylinder heads.